Good morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest In Conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we are in conversation with Mr. Philip Goh, the Asia Pacific Regional Vice President for the International Air Transport Association, or IATA as we all call it. Philip, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt. Good to be here.
Congratulations on the new post, first and foremost. You've come into the job, as we say, interesting times. I found out that actually may you live in interesting times is actually kind of a curse and not really a blessing. And aviation's going through a really hard time right now. But how are you settling into the new post and what's going on with you?
Well, again, thank you very much, Matt, for that. It's been almost 3 months now, but I'll tell you, it feels like a lot longer. Aviation has been a big part of my life. You might know that I was with Singapore Airlines for more than 30 years before I joined IATA. To be back to contribute to the industry in this way is certainly very special for me, and I'm really humbled by this opportunity that has been given to me to lead IATA in the region. I would say in my short time in IATA, I found it to be a dynamic organization, very good people we have in here, and it's been involved in so many aspects of the industry, and then I'm actually discovering more and more every day as to how we can make a difference. So my current priorities, I would say, besides strongly advocating for border reopening, which is obvious, is to really get to know our members better, to get to know the stakeholders in the industry better, and also, of course, my own IATA team here.
Let's talk about what's on everybody's mind today. I mean, you and I are both based in Singapore, and I love the name Omicron variant. It sounds like a good Star Trek episode. And as you just mentioned, borders are reopening. Singapore's got vaccinated travel lanes. And there's huge pent-up demand of people wanting to travel. I think the Singapore Airlines website crashed a couple of times when the vaccinated travel lanes were announced. I mean, people they want to go places. They want to travel. Omicron reared its ugly head a week ago, 2 weeks ago. Japan closed its borders, although they seem to be changing their minds as of today, which is December the 2nd. Israel closed its borders. What are you telling your industry members? Obviously, I mean, the WHO, to me, it's a little bit confusing. At first, they said, let's adjust international travel measures in a timely manner. And then you've got the head of the UN saying, don't close borders, don't do that. And it's kind of too late because the virus is already around the world already. What's the message that you're giving your members, and what are you hearing in return from them?
Matt, first of all, websites crashing need not necessarily be a bad thing. It just shows that there are lots of people are just very keen to get on and get traveling again. But I agree with you. Unfortunately, we are seeing some knee-jerk reactions, just as you mentioned. General border closure, and then also in some places a return to rather undifferentiated kind of a quarantine, which is very unhelpful for trying to get the air travel market to recover. We continue to advocate an evidence-based kind of approach. We say, follow the science, avoid all these knee-jerk reactions. As for Omicron, I think a lot is still not known about the variant. So I think governments over the last 2 years have gained a lot of experience in managing the COVID disease, and we should use vaccination and testing as the means in which to ring fence, I think, exposure, and then of course lift the restrictions when they are no longer needed. I think border closure is just such a blunt instrument for managing the crisis. And we can ask, how long can you keep the border closed, right? At some point, you need to open. So when is the right time to open? And there will be many more variants that you can expect from time to time. So I think travel restrictions like border closure are really not a long-term solution. I think IATA, we have developed a blueprint for restart the recovery in the aviation market, and it is really a guide for governments to use very simple, predictable, and practical steps and measures as they reopen their borders. So we actually encourage all the governments to make use of that document.
Well, it's interesting to me. I mean, you talk about border closures being a blunt instrument. It doesn't work. I mean, Japan said, okay, we're going to close the borders to everybody, and then all of a sudden they've got 2 or 3 or 4 cases. It doesn't work. I mean, because the virus is already halfway around the world when it gets discovered. So I don't see the point. Anyway, also I wanted to ask you, because IATA's been very good about messaging. I talked to your predecessor about this a lot, talking about managing risks and things like that. And when you talk about the data-driven approach, what do you mean by that? How do you members interpret that?
So I think firstly, Matt, we should recognize that the situation today is quite different from, let's say, 18 to 20 months ago. At the time, COVID-19 tests and vaccines were not available. Today, they are widely available. And we also know how the virus basically transmits and gets passed on from one person to another. So the precautions, I think, that we can take, such as all the safety measures like mask wearing or hygiene practices or in fact social distancing, for example, all these are there to be used to find ways to control spread. And also, I think treatments are nowadays available for infection. So we're quite different from many months ago. And we really want governments to use evidence-based approaches, supported by data. So we say follow the science, meaning look at the transmissibility, the immune escape, and the severity of disease. And with 2 years of data, including on Delta, and of course, I know eventually also on data on Omicron, we should have enough information to help governments to make better decisions. And since you and I are based here, really, if you look at Singapore's VTL experience with other countries, they have found 1 positive case out of every 1,000 arrivals since September. So I think it is understanding this kind of information and what the data is telling us that provides more confidence for governments to continue to open up and encourage air travel recovery. So, well, we still say that to governments that use the blueprint document that we have circulated, to take an approach to managing the crisis, make it consistent, make it predictable, and then, of course, they must always put good efforts into clear communication with travelers.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, communications with travelers and governments, things like that. It's interesting to me. I mean, I talked about this with your predecessor, but also in IATA has been very good, again, about promoting standards. And for things like the IATA Travel Pass, the Commons Project, things like that. I mean, my wife is traveling now. Actually, she took advantage of the VTLs, Vaccinated Travel Lanes. And so she's been in the U.S., she's in Europe right now, and she's going to come back to Singapore soon. But the problem is I had to kill a lot of trees printing out all of these documents for her to carry with her and not just for the U.S. or Europe, but also for Singapore, for the pass to get back in. When are we going to have some standards for the digital health passes, the vaccine passes, testing passes, whatever you want to call it? IATA has been calling for this for a long time. Again, you've got the travel pass. Commons Project has the Commons Pass. I mean, there's dozens of applications, apps out there, but we don't have standards, and you have to have 5 or 6 different apps or 5 or 6 different pieces of paper to travel internationally. What's holding that back?
Man, I think what we need are really digital tools, and the IATA Travel Pass indeed is a digital tool. It is very simple to use. It's easy to use. So the other thing about the IATA Travel Pass is, of course, the access to the thematic database that we have, which is a very unique feature of the IATA Travel Pass. If you think about it, there's so many different government entry requirements, all over the world. So I think running checks via the thematic database to see if entry requirements are met would be invaluable for travelers. We don't really see the IATA Travel Pass as being the only solution. As you rightly pointed out, there are several others, and I think it's okay to have alternatives. The key point really is that we do need digital platforms to help us organize all these credentials and so forth. I think it's good to have choice, and I'm a firm believer of supporting a competitive market for solutions, because every time you have competition, you bring better products to the market. The other point I would add is that actually the most important thing is to have standards for digital test certificates and vaccine certificates. And on that note, IATA does recommend to governments that are kind of trying to find a way out of landing on the solution to consider using Europe's digital COVID certificate, the EU DCC in short. Because it's a good model for states to adopt. So in the absence of any others that they are trying to derive, they should maybe take a look at the EU DCC.
Well, I'm curious, you mentioned competition and things like that. I mean, is this the time for? I mean, should companies really be? I mean, it's one thing to come up with to spend billions of dollars on a vaccine, but I mean, do we need the competition right now for the aviation industry? I mean, can't we just agree on a set of standards? And whether it's, and what I mean is, when I travel, I've got my passport, and whether I'm going to Cambodia or whether I'm going to Hong Kong or whether I'm going to China, they slip the passport into the electronic reader, and it reads things based on a certain set of standards. A long time ago, when I was traveling, the first time I started traveling overseas, we had the yellow card. That tells you how old I am. And it showed my yellow fever vaccination and my hepatitis B vaccination, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, instead of the aviation industry competing, can't we agree on a set of standards that would match that same standard that was approved by the WHO back then for these digital health passports or vaccination passports, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it would be good to have, most people adopt the same kind of digital tool. And if you think about it, when the air travel market recovers to a meaningful volume versus pre-COVID times, we are not going to be able to manage all the paper-based, your yellow booklet for yellow fever as an example. You're just going to be spending 4, 5, 6, 7 hours at the airport just going through those check-in and those clearances. So definitely a digital tool, and quite a number of airlines have already signed on to the IATA Travel Pass. Many more are in the stages of testing, as well as contract evaluation. So we do expect that the tool will be used by many carriers as we go forward. There are some that are a bit slow, just because I think it's not really top of mind at the moment, because they look at their volume and they say, oh, it's kind of few passengers on a plane. Why do I need a tool like that? But if you think another 6 months, 9 months, they are not going to be able to manage. So we are advocating and encouraging people to catch on to it quickly.
I'm curious. I mean, your job, at least according to when I was talking to your predecessor, but your job and IATA's job, you spend a lot of time talking to transportation ministers, aviation ministers, people like that. Conrad mentioned that he's actually been spending a lot of time with health ministers. Is that something that you're running into? And again, it goes back to managing risks. When you talk to governments, are you still talking to the transport people, or do they throw in a lot of deputy ministers for the health department?
So there certainly have been lots of conversations with policymakers, and yes, the health departments are, at this time and for this crisis, very important stakeholders to have serious conversations around the table. But having said that, we continue to engage transport ministers and their department people, as we always have. I think transport is the main theme for aviation, so we have to include other constituents, other stakeholders, and in some places we're also talking with ministries of foreign affairs, for example. There are some countries where this comes into play. But I think it is quite obvious that not all states have the same risk appetite, and they all respond differently, even to the same risk. So I think part of it, I think we can understand the robustness of national health systems must be a huge factor in the response to this crisis. So, I mean, this is a health crisis, right? And which is why borders were, closed all those months back in last year. So I think we really have a whole spectrum of governments and their appetites, from the Europes and the US, much faster in opening up to the more conservative Asian governments. And well, that's partly also because the vaccination rates are much lower in parts of this region. And so I think they're worried that health system cannot cope because in some places maybe not as advanced or less comprehensive. So those are, understandable concerns governments have. So we do understand all of that. And to their credit, we are seeing that they are starting to get a message and opening up in a kind of a risk managed way, until of course Omicron comes about. So this will likely to pause the reopening a little bit, and it looks like a couple of steps back.
I want to ask very quickly, and then we're going to take a break for just a second. It's interesting to me because one of my favorite countries in Asia is Cambodia, and they have actually reopened, no quarantine. Omicron may change that, although we're seeing mixed messages on Omicron, because you've got one CEO of vaccine makers saying, it could be more dangerous. Another CEO says, no, it looks like it's mild cases, things like that. We really don't know right now. And you've got places like Thailand, places like Cambodia that are basically reopening their economies and saying, look, we can't survive without tourism. We have to open the borders. And I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but in Singapore, people have been complaining because you can't play music in a restaurant, or the restaurants have to close at 10:30 at night, and they're saying, how is that contributing to conquering the virus? Is there a right way and a wrong way to handle this, or is it just what do we do?
Well, I would say you hit the bullseye there. I think it's really quite difficult to say whether there's a right way or a wrong way. Maybe right or wrong are not so useful in terms of describing the efforts that people are putting into restoring the travel market. For me, the more appropriate way is whether those things they are doing are more helpful or more appropriate, or less helpful or less appropriate. And I think it is why we are calling on the governments to avoid making knee-jerk type of reactions. I mean, if you have a set of measures that you progressively are rolling out, people understand why. If for example you understand that transmission, a lot of it happens when people are masked off, for example, under indoor settings, and these are explained clearly, and the science goes with it. I think people understand that some of these restrictions, there's a reason for them. And I keep coming back to this, but IATA's blueprint for recovery really is there to guide governments in terms of what might be more appropriate to do and what would be less helpful. So we continue to ask that they refer to this and see how to implement it. Because after all the transport ministers were the one that agreed to all these kind of a whole series of steps at the ICAO HLCC conference not long ago. So we continue to advocate that.
Okay, Philip, we need to take a quick break here to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're in conversation with Philip Goh, the Asia Pacific Regional Vice President for IATA. Philip, let's move on to another topic. I'm actually tired of talking about COVID, but it seems like that's all we talk about these days. It seems like I can't read a news story about aviation, and I read as many as I can, obviously. Everybody talks about aviation polluting the world. Talk about flight shaming, things like that. I personally, yes, I cover the industry, but I think the industry gets a bad rap. If you look at the shipping industry with bunker fuel, that's bunker fuel is about the dirtiest kind of fuel that you can use. Is aviation, though? And again, aviation has been talking a lot in the last few years about going green, about sustainability. Do you think it's doing enough to overcome this, what I would call a messaging problem? And is it doing it fast enough? IATA's talked about 2050. I think that's a little bit, I don't think it should take that long. But, I'm not Willie Walsh, so what do I know? Tell us what you think about the sustainability in aviation right now.
Yeah, Matt, I think many may not remember that it was way back in 2009 that the aviation industry was the first major global industry sector to set environmental targets. And but having said that, we were well ahead of other industries at that point. We also recognize that the 50 by 2050 target, which is reduced by 50% by 2050, is actually no longer sufficient today. So that's why at our recent AGM, annual general meeting, all IATA members took a historic decision to pass a resolution to achieve net carbon emission zero by 2050, right? I think it's not going to be an easy task, but we think that it is possible. It is possible through a combination of actions. And also it's possible if you bring in a whole series of people to work on it. So things, for example, like manufacturing more SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, is one. New technology is the other, whether it's new aircraft or new propulsion systems. And then you have the improvements to operations and infrastructure as a third, and maybe also the offsetting and carbon capture, as a fourth way. And what I like to emphasize really is that this issue that we're trying to tackle is not just for airlines. In fact, the involvement of multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem is key. So we're talking about, for example, the oil suppliers, of course all the aircraft manufacturers and the engine manufacturers. We're talking about the airports of the world, but also crucially governments. Governments will have to come and make policy and maybe also incentivize things like the production of more sustainable aviation fuel. That will make on the journey towards achieving this target more realistic. And while it's a very big challenge to achieve net zero by 2050, I'm sure if all the parties work together, we can get there.
Okay. Listen, I used to work in Washington. I worked for Congress. I worked for a congressman a long time ago when I was much, much younger. And I guarantee you, if we're waiting for governments to actually do something, then we're all in a lot of trouble, especially if it's the U.S. government, because it's never going to happen. And that's just my opinion. I'm just editorializing there, because the governments are, that is one of the biggest problems right now, is the governments. But let me ask you a question. I've noticed that in the recent, last few years, especially the last year, the aviation industry everybody's been issuing press release after press release after press release saying, here's what we're going to do to go green. And then we've seen COVID hit, and IATA's own figures, I mean, the industry has lost hundreds of billions of US dollars. Does the industry actually have the money because it costs money to invest in SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, new technology, new airplanes, things like that. And my next question is going to be on hydrogen, but, does the industry have the money now to invest in that? I mean, people are going to want to recover from what they've lost during the pandemic.
You're right there. So I'll be the first to admit, Matt, that short term is indeed going to be very tough, right? But I think as an industry, we also need to look beyond the short term. So this environment and sustainability challenge is not a short-term game, it's a long-term game. So I think sustainability being at the top of the industry's agenda for already so many years, just because we're going through a very difficult period right now, shouldn't make us turn our eyes away from sustainability. I think that's the first point I'd like to make. Of course, second thing is that the COVID-19 crisis really has highlighted the important role that aviation plays in connecting people, in connecting businesses, and making sure that essential supplies are flowing throughout the global system. So cargo, for example, have played a very important part during this time. PPE deliveries, medical equipment, vaccines, and you name it. So I think there's no mistaking crucial role that aviation plays in how the world system works. And we also need to recognize that, in IATA we say the freedom to fly, right? It depends on our ability to fly sustainably. So not just fly, but find a sustainable way to fly. And the problem is not flying. The problem is carbon emission. So our challenge is to tackle and reduce carbon emission, not reduce flight, right? And so I think we have to recover back to better times sustainably. And one of the big push is not just the industry itself, it's the passengers, it's the customers that's demanding, expecting, investors and so governments as well. So it's the right thing to do for the industry to move in that way. And therefore all the stakeholders and all the CEOs of airlines need to look beyond the short term. There will be some short-term pain, that's for sure. But this is a long game, right? So I think we all need to cast our eyes on that end goal and kind of manage the short-term pain.
Well, I hope the shareholders understand. I'm from the U.S., so I know capitalists, and when it hits their bottom line, they don't like that very much. Let's stick with the environment as well, and this is my last question, next to the last question. Everybody's been talking about hydrogen, which I think is kind of a pipe dream, just because of the infrastructure that's going to be needed to create a hydrogen fuel system throughout the aviation world. Airbus has released, and I love Airbus, they're great people, but they've released these beautiful images of these planes that they think are going to be flying by 2035, and they might, but hydrogen is not new. I mean, the Russians flew a hydrogen-powered plane back in the 1980s, so this is not new. But the infrastructure that's required for this, and not just that, but Pratt & Whitney themselves, I was on a webinar with one of their top scientists, and he said, look, the amount of hydrogen available today, clean hydrogen or green hydrogen, would only fuel about 10% of the world's commercial aircraft fleet. Is hydrogen power just a pipe dream, or is this something that people are really talking about?
I think first and foremost, interest in this kind of technology is certainly growing. And I think the technology programs that we are seeing envisaged the entry of service around about 2035, approximately, that kind of time frame. So it's another 15 years down the road. And no doubt things will evolve as they find better ways, maybe start from smaller planes and they will develop further. But new technology, we can't run away from it. And of course, hydrogen being as a fuel is certainly one part of the elements that will help us to achieve net zero carbon emission way down 2050. I think you're right. Some of the challenges will be there, whether it is the availability of hydrogen in a large scale, or the need to produce green hydrogen, as well as you have mentioned, the existence of supply infrastructure to be able to hold and store these. So these are all the challenges that the industry have to face. But certainly that's probably part of the solution. I wouldn't say it's the bulk of it, particularly in the short term, but looking towards the future, I think we can't count out technology as one of the solutions.
Okay. Philip, last question. Our time is running out. I always try to end these shows on a bright note. You've been in your job now, you said, for about 3 months. What's the bright spot in the aviation world in Asia Pacific and perhaps globally that's going on right now? What are you looking forward to? And put you on the spot, do you think the Singapore Air Show is going to happen?
That's a good question. From what we understand until recently, it sure looks like it's going ahead. I don't know what Omicron will do to it though. So that's a bit kind of a bit early days to tell. But certainly, I think there's a lot of determination and resolve by the organizers to to hold the event. And IATA is very actively working actually with the organizers and also the Singapore government to support the air show. And of course, as you might know, we sponsor the Changi Aviation Summit at the air show. I think that before Omicron, everything is now kind of clouded by Omicron. But before that, we really have seen a unmistakable positive shift in the region's government's reopening plans. And that's of course all my colleagues have been working together with various stakeholders in the countries to advocate for these reopening positions. And if that were to come back and kind of continues, then I think it will pave the way for the holding the air show. This is February next year, so it's some months to go, but also it's not that far away. And so I suppose I'm looking forward and counting, the days to a better time after we have overcome the speed bump of Omicron.
Well, and I tell you, I mean, the bright spot I think for all of us is you look at when borders have reopened. I mean, the airlines have been flooded. Thanksgiving in the U.S., you had millions of people flying. People want to travel. So, I mean, I think we can look forward to that if and when these things do, when things do clear up a little bit. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, certainly agree. And I, for one, I've not traveled long distances for coming to 2 years. So I before the closures and all of that, I travel a lot, both on business as well and on my own holiday. So I do miss flying, and I certainly look forward to a brighter time ahead. And just maybe, a few more crashes of websites might just be, be the indicator to good times ahead.
Yeah, I miss flying too. I miss going to France for my usual summer vacation with my French in-laws because my mother-in-law is the best cook there. Philip Goh, Regional Vice President for Asia Pacific at the International Air Transport Association. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks for having me.